when you're small,
Mm.
everyone just knows everything. When you get bigger, including where we are, it's like, how are we going to announce this? How should we tell people this? When should we announce it? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you could argue, well, that's just the way it is. You have to start controlling the message. But another argument could be, well, why is it like that? Why can't it be like it was in the early days? Or why can't technology help it be a bit like it was in the early days? Okay, so a bit of background, I guess. We, like most companies at this current time, we've been thinking a lot about our current customers and our future customers and how we're going to position ourselves and what we really want to say to customers moving forward. And a couple of things, as we've done that, we've been talking to lots of customers and existing customers and potential customers and others in the industry. And there's a couple of things that have just, bubbled up that we just wanted to talk about. And I'll just put something out there, and that can be the start of the conversation. But when we think about companies, I'm talking about sort of larger companies that have multiple locations, significant amounts of customers, more than, say, a handful of customers. Generally speaking, when you think about a company, there are two groups of people that are really important to them. There's their customers, obviously, and there's their employees. And if you go to most big companies' websites or their annual reports or whatever, there will be some version of why their staff is one of their competitive advantages. So I think most people would agree that actually, as an asset, if you can call people that can move around whenever they want as an asset, it's quite an important one. It's certainly probably one of the most expensive ones that a company has. And yet, if you compare the amount of energy, creativity, and of course money that goes into communicating with customers to how companies communicate with their staff and how they understand the staff journey and all that kind of stuff, it's kind of weirdly extreme. It's not like close, it's really extreme. So we were talking to someone this week, I won't say who it is or what company it was, but it's a big PLC. And she openly admitted that internal comms was massively undervalued, underloved. Basically, she said the only way she can really communicate effectively with her frontline staff is to send them letters in the post, right? You compare that to what this company, I can't say who it is, but compared to the amount of money they spend on communicating with their customers, it's just night and day. And so that's where kind of what we want to talk about today. Why does that happen? I mean, some of it might be, I don't know. Why does it happen? Because the two groups are super, super important to the company's future and success. And yet it kind of, there's this real weird disconnect from, I guess, leadership, that they don't really see the value in that kind of communication, or they haven't quite figured it out yet or understood maybe the ROI for that communication. So
I think it comes down to, complacency, really. So if you look at the leadership structure of most kind of established large companies, you often won't see a seat at the table for HR or people. Like when we were recruiting around head of people, one of the key things was, will they actually be considered part of the leadership team or just senior management? Because apparently it's quite rare for people to have a place at that table. So that is obviously a critical function, right? So if they're not being represented, then they're not being spoken about. And if you're not being spoken about, then you're not really going to be funded, are you? Because typically large amounts of funding need to be justified. Then if you also consider that of that leadership team, how many of those leaders would be customer facing? Will probably be quite a few, at least 50%, maybe more. I don't know. I'm trying to think of how a board structure would typically work. But if you're thinking of marketing, sales, success, and no doubt, operations, which is often things like, say, if it was a store operations, most of that operational budget will still go into customer facing elements, not like the back office staff room, I would have thought, but it would be more what's the experience in that store. So if everything you talk about is so heavily weighted towards customers, you could be inclined to think that that's the only thing that matters. But then, as you say, people. But then, if they say that people are their greatest asset, they may often not really believe it. It might just sound like a good thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, typically, if you really do think something is your greatest asset, you do normally put a lot of money there. No, well, I suppose the point is actually they do put a lot of money there. I mean, that probably is their greatest.
Yeah, salaries are probably one of their highest budget lines. Yeah.
So you could maybe the argument is that they conflate that with their communications, as in like, well, we already spend a fortune on our people. We've got to spend an equal amount on customers to justify it and to grow. But I think that's probably just a technicality of budget. I think the reality is it's about who has the voices in the room when decisions are being made. And typically those internal facing functions and people facing functions don't.
Also, it's a kind of cultural thing as well. So when we think about customers, we talk about, in terms of, creating the most value for customers, or that we talk in those kind of terms. How can we really solve customers' problems? How can we maximize the value that they get from our product? How can we help them do this? How can we help them do that? How can we basically give them more of our stuff basically to sell? And when we think about employees, we're thinking about how do we manage them? How do we control them? How do we make them stick to the rules? How do we? I know I'm generalizing here, but there is a sort of culturally different approach to people in that sense, and maybe it's kind of a little bit like, if you're the person paying for something, if you go to a restaurant, you expect it's kind of almost okay if you're a bit demanding because you're the customer, and the restaurant has to be a little bit fawning because they're the provider. And maybe it's something along those lines, like, customer pays us, we use that money to pay staff, and therefore in the sort of hierarchy of I know.
Yeah, I think there is something to that, but I think also it's just that the relationship between companies and employees has changed really radically over the last sort of 50 years. And in terms of, it's kind of interesting because tenure has dropped massively, right? If you consider like our father, and mother's generation, it would be quite conceivable they could be working at a company for like 20 years, or 10 years or something. Now I think the average tenure is sort of around 2 or 18 months to 2. Now I wonder if would that tenure change a lot with the companies that have really nailed this down. I mean, it doesn't stop the need for communication, because whether it's a short period or a long period, you still got to invest in it to make it maximize the most. In fact, if anything, if the tenure is short, the communication needs to be better, because you're getting that many more people more regularly up to speed on what's going on. So I'm not really sure. I think it's, it's evolved from a fairly mundane place where, as far as I can see, internal comms really was just a delivery team, which
it's kind of tactical.
Yeah, just go and spread this word.
Yeah, someone needs to tell you something about, make sure you do something on Friday or whatever. But interesting, I saw a report somewhere that said that basically showed as companies got bigger, their employees became less engaged, right? Which you kind of think, okay, well that sort of makes sense. I can get that. And in some ways, I think from our own experience, when we first started our first company and there was 3 or 4 of us in the room or whatever, everyone knew everything about everything that was going on. And although there was hierarchy to an extent, it was more of a hierarchy of roles. Like the founders would have the conversation with the bank, but really everybody was kind of involved in what was going on and some of the decisions that were made and that kind of stuff. And obviously, as you got bigger, that becomes less practical. And in some ways, I guess that's part of the problem, why people become less engaged as the company gets bigger, because they feel like they're not part of the fabric of what's going on. Maybe they don't know what's going on, or maybe they're just told on a need to know basis. And And I guess part of the challenge then is it's less about how do we make sure that people know that, you know, Friday is a deadline for pension, blah, 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 blah. How do you kind of move that from something where people genuinely feel like they're informed about what's important in the company, and they're not just told on a kind of need to know basis? Like, you know, when you're small, everyone just knows everything. When you get bigger, including where we are, it's like, how are we going to announce this? How should we tell people this? When should we announce it? You know, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you could argue, well, that's just the way it is. You have to start controlling the message. But another argument could be, well, why is it like that? Why can't it be like it was in the early days? Or why can't technology help it be a bit like it was in the early days?
I think it can, but I think that as you get larger, consistency becomes more important, because it's even if the message is the same. Like if me and you both make the same announcement, we will make it slightly differently. Not because we don't both know like the facts. It's just that we will maybe emphasize elements more or less than others. Also, like when you announce something, you know, typically you don't announce every single minor function of it. Let's say like a deal has been agreed, it would be the top line terms, right? But again, there's some natural bias in that. Like what were the terms that matter most to you, you know, versus me, for example. Like, so as in you could tell the same story honestly, but still come away from it thinking slightly different emphasis.
Yeah.
Like this, it was a big customer win. You know, if you were more sales inclined, you might be more inclined to emphasize the revenue. But if you were more product inclined, you might say, this is so significant because it shows that this recent product we've done has now stuck with that, you know, with that target. You see what I mean? Like it's the same thing. They've bought the product and they've paid the money, but where do you put your emphasis will quite often come back to what matters most to you, for example. And neither is wrong. It's just, then imagine how that kind of Chinese whispers or rolls out. Then people thinking, oh, right, yeah, the best thing about winning that customer was the product, like justification, or the best thing about winning that customer was the money that they gave us. Right. So that's where I think you have to be consistent in sort of like, how are we delivering it? In what way are we delivering it? So that it isn't sort of multi-delivered, but in a sort of way where it doesn't completely add up. So I think that's where that comes from. But the other point, sorry, what was the other point you saying? Something? Yeah.
I don't know. Well, one of the things I guess I was thinking is the difference between
technology.
How has technology? You'd think as we got bigger, one of the things that technology normally does is make is allow companies to scale efficiently.
Yeah.
But one of the things that it seems like companies have been particularly bad at scaling is that kind of that family culture that you get in a startup.
Yeah, and I wonder if that is a bit to do with, well, I think a lot of companies have that more traditional top-down approach, which is announcements only come from the top. I think that it's fair to say that that isn't the right way. I think certain announcements must come from the top, and if they don't, it's almost like leadership ducking the responsibility or whatever it might be. But like, for example, I think yesterday at ScreenCloud is a really good example, the video that our hardware and players team made. So that was like a big company announcement about a large project, but it was a video format because we're all over different time zones. So it's really hard for us to get every single person on a call at the same time. In fact, we only ever really do it once a month for all hands. And even then it's not mandatory because it gets recorded, because for someone, it's a bad time of day. And also there's people on holiday, etc. But that's our best stab at getting everyone on together. So asynchronous video is a really big thing for us. And actually, as people are getting more and more comfortable making videos, if you look at the big comms updates that we give as a company, they are, I mean, what percentage of them are leadership? I'd say it's certainly less than 50%. If you think of all of the work in progress video demos, that has nothing to do with me or you or Luke. Or other leaders, maybe Nick, possibly on product, but Nick doesn't make every product announcement. But because we can use technology and we can use the right people to make those right videos and announce it. And yes, like those videos do get sort of well, if it's a small demo, they don't get signed off. But like, for example, yesterday's one was a big announcement of the end of a project that was reviewed by people. I mean, I viewed it, but I didn't review it. There was nothing. I suppose I would have had a kind of, oh, there's something wrong there, but I didn't make any changes. It was more FYI. I think that starts to give much more of a voice across the company. And also there's a lot of effort put in, like the videos are really well thought through. They're kind of like, what's the message? What's in it for other people when they watch this sort of thing? And I think traditionally it was expected that those kind of announcements would be almost presented back to the top, and then the top would sort of present them on behalf. And again, I suppose if you're going out to market, you might do that. That said, I don't know if, I mean, like, there is some weight in leadership making product announcements and things like that, but it's also really cool to hear from the people that made it. You know, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I suppose for me it comes down to, so that's an interesting example of how I guess people in different locations commute, sort of sharing information between each other and between locations. But I kind of keep coming back to this idea of like, it's kind of weird that big companies, and this one that we spoke to, they're very, very well-known brand. They spend, I don't know how much they spend, literally, it would be tens of millions, probably even more, on advertising every year around their brand and to their customers. And I just kind of, it's kind of odd to me that for some reason, I don't know, the most creative people in the company are not employed to kind of help employees, if you like, or to engage employees. Like, that might be a bit of a generalization, but if you look at, I guess, and again, it might come down to HR, but you don't think of HR generally as being super creative, right? You see them,
no,
they're kind of traditionally kind of, as you said, like more administrative, more making sure that people's pension letters go out, or, you know, the redundancy packages is being tied down. And that's partly, so the part of the problem, I think, is where does this sit? Where does this kind of creative thinking, when this company or these big companies are thinking about their customers, and they're working with advertising agencies, they've got the most creative brains within the company thinking about innovative ways they can either understand customers better, or understand their journey better, or understand how to acquire them better. That just doesn't exist really with, I mean, I'm sure it does. There are some companies that are really good at this, but imagine if you applied the same kind of logic to acquiring employees as you do to employing, or the same level of creativity, or the same level of understanding of the customer user journey that you do the employee user journey, or an understanding of the kind of key metrics that make that are kind of indicators of whether a customer is going to be successful or not. It's just kind of weird to me when I think about it, and you know, we're as guilty as anyone else. I think probably in our approach, we've definitely thought about, when we think about these sorts of things, we think about it in terms of customers. But it's weird that, given how important employees are to companies, that level of creativity and strategic thinking doesn't happen. It all seems to be, well, not all, but in many cases, it seems to be tactical, reactive, responsive stuff. There's not really someone at leadership going, right, we really need to think about how we communicate within the group. We need to really think smartly about this. How can we get the best minds to really understand the user journey in terms of the employees, and how they share information and all that kind of stuff?
I think, So I think there's two things to that. I think that, firstly, it's a mindset at leadership, right? And often that leadership has probably been promoted out of being the ones who have been commercially the most successful for the company. So they have a customer first mindset anyway. And also, let's also give a bit of credit the other way. In the last sort of 20 years, there has been a revolution in how companies and customers form relationships and bonds, right? I mean, if you think of what customer service was like back in the 80s and 90s compared to what it is today, like how accessible brands are, how like tone of voice. I mean, there has been a bit of a revolution there, and I imagine a lot of companies have kind of had to respond pretty heavily to that, as well as let's not be the online revolution too.
Yeah.
So I guess that the focus has gone there, because that has been the relationship between a company, a brand, and a customer used to be quite transactional, and now is quite different. It's quite varied, and I imagine that's spooked everyone quite a lot. So it's not crazy to see why so much emphasis went over there. But the second point is maybe a bit more cynical than that. That's me like giving them a nice excuse. The other one is probably that putting a lot of this strategic effort in internally is going to be slower to see the results than putting a lot of effort in now into customer acquisition and retention and growth. Like if you were to spend, $1 million this quarter on that, you'd expect to see some results by Christmas time.
Yeah.
Right? Now,
maybe even quicker. Like
maybe
I'm
fast.
sure.
Yeah. You could
TV campaign
goes
out. If it's a consumer brand, TV campaign goes out 1 week, you expect to see the results of the weekend, or some results, I would imagine.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, there's literally, if you're talking about employee life cycle, and hopefully is over more than 2 years and things like that, and actually starts earlier. If you're talking about building awareness, building employer brand, the whole process of recruitment, you could be talking like a 3-year, 4-year life cycle on average, and maybe longer. And actually, where you really see the results in that is potentially years away. There probably will be some immediate like stuff, but it will be more, that was good, that was well received, but the actual impact to business is unlikely to be felt instantly, and could take. So you've got to really take a long-term view on it. And I think when you have a long-term view where you're not going to get obvious immediate results, that means you have to have true faith and belief. And again, that comes back to leadership. Like, is this a firmly held belief that the leadership have that doing this is important? Or is it something they feel they have to do?
I guess the other thing is, if it's going to take 3 or 4 years and the average tenure is 2 years, then it might be like but it's kind of, I mean, I've been looking at this, and the research, I don't think there's a huge amount of research out there, but I did see one survey done by Gallup, which showed that looking at companies that have in the top percentile of employee engagement and the bottom, comparing those two, there was a marked difference in terms of productivity, profitability, obviously turnover of staff and that kind of thing. But there is a specific link between an engaged workforce and profit, right? Yeah. So there's a link there. Now, I guess what the trouble is it's really hard. It's a lot harder to prove than the link between I've spent £5 million or dollars on a TV campaign, and then we, in the tills over the weekend, we saw an additional 10 million that came, exactly. Whatever it is.
So imagine you're going back to the market with your quarterly earnings update, right? Because that's how it's judged. That's how your stock price is judged if you're a big floated company. And you're basically trying to justify the next 3 months.
Yeah.
And then you come out with this. How's the market going to react to that? So the game is skewed away from doing things like this. But I think you made a good point in another meeting where we talked about this, where you said that your belief, and I agree with you, is that in the back of most leaders' minds, they know this really is important and makes a difference. Like, they know that, if you just said to most people, do you think a highly engaged workforce would be better for your business than a non-highly engaged? Like, they would always say yes, right? Like, and then you say why, and you'd probably give the reasons. Well, probably better productivity, lower turnover, just being a bit more kind of understanding of what's important and what matters and where to focus their energy, etc. Like, I think everyone would agree. Sort of, I mean, I can't even almost make the contrarian point on that one. I'm not really sure how I could, do it. Like, it doesn't make sense. Apart from maybe taking some sort of like Ryanair principles where you've cut your margins so fine that you've just passed everything to the customer. But I can't.
Or you just don't care. You just go, to be honest, anyone could do this job. It's just, I don't know.
Yeah. So basically the kind of complete mindset. But I mean, even then, even saying, well, it doesn't matter that you don't care. If you think, do you actually think that if you're almost like irrelevant what you think, do you think that would be better or worse in terms of outcome? I'd say it's got to be close to an 8 or 9 out of 10 that would agree with that
Yeah.
statement. And yet so few do. And I think is not dissimilar to the mindset people have around content marketing, right? We've talked about that in the past, and how, it is a long game. And actually in the first period, you probably won't see any return on kind of a lot of that content. There'll be some wins and things like that, but ultimately, I think in that presentation that Beth did and you did, and I kind of helped present it about content marketing, there's that slide where it's sort of, this is where we used our own data on content, and it's like 1 year in, it's sort of bubbling along, doing a little bit, but it's pretty chicken feedy. And then like after about a year, it starts to compound and grow. And then you've got that arrow going like, you quit here, I think. It's like on the 11th month or something. And I got a feeling that this fits into a similar camp where you're bubbling along, spending money, people are kind of doing stuff, but you can't feel impact, and maybe starting to get a bit frustrated. Maybe you're going through lean times like we're, like the world's about to, or is currently. And you're thinking, should I keep pushing on this? It doesn't seem to be working. And it's because some things just take longer to show their true benefit. But the beauty of it is that once it's rolling, the benefit keeps on coming, and comes in faster cycles, right? Because that better, more engaged workforce is going to attract better people to come in, and they're going to become more engaged more quickly when everyone around them already is, and they're not met with a wall of cynicism on their first week or whatever it might be. And so it does, if you're playing a long-term game, which is what really leaders should be doing, but let's be honest, aren't always doing, because the world doesn't always reward them. I mean, actually talking about tenure, I can't quote it straight away, but there's the tenure of a CEO at a listed company in the US has dropped massively, hasn't it? It's not long. Like effectively, it's just like look at sport. I mean, I probably understand that one, but I can't remember the statistic on it. But like, say like a tenure of a CEO used to be kind of plus 5 years or more. It's now like 2 years, 18 months. And it's same with football. Like we used to, like Alex Ferguson, my hero, manager of Man United for 25 years. Now, obviously, he was successful and super successful in that time, but not at the very beginning. And then, Arsene Wenger, he was like 15 odd years, maybe more. And now it's dropped to, if you don't come in and make instant results, you might not last the season. You might not even get one season. You might get a few months. So that massively incentivized short-term thinking. So you make probably the wrong recruit. You just go for the striker that is on form now. You don't build through youth. You don't, you don't send the scouts out to look for the undiscovered gem in less obvious parts of Europe or the world. You just buy the famous one that's banging in goals in for your competitor and spend a load of money on it. And it may work out, right?
So I guess you can imagine, the CEO or, a leader within a sort of medium to large size company, they're probably that, as you say, they've got that thing, they've got that nagging doubt. Like, wouldn't it be great? Do you think that it would be great if your team could be a little bit more gelled like it was in the early days, if they've been around that long? So, I mean, I know this is on a micro level, but when we were at Cogent, our agency, I remember when we got to about 30, 35 people, I remember we would quite often go, remember the days when we were 10 or 12? That was so much more fun. It was so much, it was more profitable. It was, everyone was on the same page. We didn't have anywhere near as many kind of staff issues. Wouldn't it be great if we could just be like that again, kind of thing? But as you get bigger, even between 12 and 35, you go 3 times as big, and things start to not be as gelled as they were. So I can imagine, you could, if you were to meet up with someone at the weekend as a CEO of a big company and say, so what's it like? And they go, it's pretty good. Sales are okay. Staff are a bit, we've got a few issues with staff. So we've got, group over here are a bit pissed off, or we've had some problems over here. been having some more problems on Glassdoor. People have been slagging me off a bit, that kind of thing. But really, I don't really know how to solve it. And actually, what I'm really being measured on is my quarterly growth or my quarterly profits. Yeah. And it's one of those things. It's like, it's annoying. It pisses me off. I wish I could solve it. A, I don't know how, and B, right now, I've got much bigger things to worry about, because if I don't hit target,
it's understandable, right? Imagine imagine we recruit imagine we're not doing it, but imagine if it was like a CMO comes in and says, right, I'm going to come in, but I'm going to need 3 years before you see the results. Like I've got a long-term strategy here. Now, obviously they'd be smart. They should put some short-term wins in as well. But us really sticking at content, like if someone came in and pushed that and it wasn't our firmly held belief, it would be hard to kind of go, okay, yeah, sure, we're going to really invest loads of money in this and probably not see anything for a long time. With like it really has to be inside you to drive it. And then, I mean, there is a tipping point, I suppose. The more people it gets inside and the more that they pioneer out like this way of working, which to a degree we've done, right? So companies come to us now. I mean, often people come to me and I'm like, I'm really the last guy who should be talking about this. But going, how did you do that? Like, how did you do that content piece? I was like, well, it wasn't me, but, talk to the people who did. But it was a firmly held belief. And when you've seen evidence, you go, okay, that works. Then maybe more people adopt it because it becomes fashionable, is maybe a wrong word to say, to do it. But right now, what we're talking about is not the fashion. It's not the trend.
But I think it's interesting what you just said there about it has to be inside you. And what we're seeing definitely is some customers that properly get this. So some customers who are saying, is interesting, and it normally comes from the top. So another customer we were talking, listening, someone had an interview with them and recorded it. It was quite interesting. And they said the dream for this communication using screens, obviously in our case, came from the CEO. He decided that he wanted to see, as they were calling it, information radiators all around the office, right? And as soon as that happened, then obviously it cascaded down. Compare that to the other company that we were talking to, and their clearly leadership don't get it at all. It's like,
well, they're sending out letters still, so that kind of gives you an indication.
And I do think, it's absolutely, it has to be something that someone in leadership properly feels passionate about and thinks this is going to make a difference to us. It might not make a difference to us next month or even the month after, but it will start to make a big difference, not just in terms of this is a nicer place to work, but actually in terms of our productivity and our profitability and our, just our ability to become a better company. And I think that's potentially where you might see winners and losers, like companies that properly get this and say, look, okay, we know that this is a long-term thing in the same way that content was to us, but we believe this. We know this is right, and this is the way, and this is going to show improvements over time, and so we're going to stick with it, and we're going to make a proper strategic commitment to this, and apply some creative thinking and see how this is going to work specifically for us, and move away from this kind of concept of it just, when it comes to employees, it's just about management and rules and communication from the CEO or whatever, missives from on high. I think that's the old world. I think the new world is probably these people that are starting to see it, like, how can we actually do this? How can we actually do this in a more creative way? And why is this important? Even if it's not, it's a bit like climate change, isn't it? Like, you stop driving your gas.
Well, that is actually the problem with climate change, is why can't politicians get their head around climate change? Is because they're elected every 4 or 5 years. Whereas, to tackle climate change, you need to be taking a 30-year view.
Yeah.
And that doesn't win elections.
And I guess as people have, that's been bashed over people's head. Increasingly, people are getting it and going, okay, we do need to do something about this. And I wonder if that's what will happen within organizations. They're like, okay, yes, it's all about our quarterly results and everything, but we really need to do something about this because we are rubbish at this. And especially as smaller companies come in and they're snapping around and they're much better at it because they're smaller, more nimble. They maybe have built their business on a kind of ethos, which is around employee inclusion and all that kind of stuff. I think
the reason I think that this will happen is actually statistical. So if you look at the top 10 most valuable companies in the world, which are mostly, I think it's predominantly dominated by tech these days. And if you compare that to the top 10 most valuable companies in the world, or in America, I think it was America, I saw this one on, in say the 1970s, it was quite often dominated by manufacturing and automotive and oil. I think the only one that was the same was an oil company, but I wonder if it's still the case, that was in both top 10s. But the biggest, and actually allowing for a sort of adjustment of inflation and things like that, they were roughly equally valuable at the time in their retrospective moments. But the key difference, and that might not be true anymore, because I think now the tech ones have gone on to even more stratospheric heights. But this was a couple of years ago I saw this. The key fundamental difference between those two those two groups, was the employee count. So for General Motors, I think they had they employed millions.
Yeah.
And Facebook, say at the time, employed 350,000. And that is the difference. Is that that's a whole other different podcast about what happens there. But in effect, you're going to be doing more with less people, primarily because of technology, and that's true for almost every company. I think that's true for pretty much every company. And so each employee in your company is going to be impactful in ways that, say, 40 years ago, they would never have been as impactful, as responsible for as much revenue or as much of this or that.
Yeah.
And so as that number continues to go down of what you can achieve with a smaller amount of people, that means you're going to have to put more effort in there, because clearly it has outsized returns moving forward. So of those 350,000 people compared to 3.5 million people, each one of them really does need to be that much more on point. And I mean, that leads into a whole other series of questions about who gets that opportunity. Does that, around education, around network, around what experience they've had before, like that becomes a real challenge about how you break into that group. But if you just look at it statistically, the biggest companies well don't need as many people as they used to, but what they do need is the best people they can. And therefore, to not think that how you engage that team is a priority, that actually looks negligent, really, if you look at it from that point of view.
Yeah.
Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, that's all very valid. Well, we kind of
we're done.
Gone over. This is something we could talk about there's so many things that you can unpeel around this. I think it's kind of interesting, but at least for today, I think we're kind of done for time. So
yeah. Speaking of employee engagement, I've still got some more to write on our all hands talk later.
Oh yeah,
so we probably do need to wrap up.
Okay,
some more writing to do. Okay.
All right. Till next time.
Cheers.